I'm Dr. Ann Heffernan. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of History. My area of research specialty is modern South African history, and a lot of my teaching involves modern African history. But today I'd like to tell you about a young woman who led a mass movement for peace in early modern Africa. She tried to end her country's civil war in the late 17th and early 18th century and to restore its monarchy. And she also, in the midst of doing all of this, became reincarnated as a man, all by the time she was 22. Her name was Danya Beatrice Kimpavita, and she was born in the Kingdom of Congo in 1684. Now, before I go any further into Danya Beatrice's story, let me give you a little bit of context about the Kingdom of Congo and the world that she was born into. These days, when we speak about the Congo, we're usually talking about one of two political nation states, either the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is indicated on this map in red, or the Republic of Congo, which is indicated on this map in purple, their neighboring countries. You'll see I've also highlighted in green Angola. And the reason I've done that is that in the 17th century, the Kingdom of Congo that I'll be speaking about today occupied territory predominantly in the north of present-day Angola and across the border in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So this is the area of the world that we're talking about today. Now, a few things to keep in mind about the Kingdom of the Congo. It was an independent African kingdom ruled by a series of monarchs for nearly 400 years. From 1390 to 1857, it was ruled by independent kings and very occasionally by queens. In 1491, one of those kings, King Zhao I, converted to Catholicism. And after his conversion, Congo became a Catholic kingdom. Catholicism became the religion of state. It wasn't only practiced at the court, although initially it was. Eventually it spread very widely throughout the countryside, and ordinary Congolese citizens ascribed to Catholic faith and practiced it. They were ministered to mostly by European missionaries, first Portuguese Jesuits, and then later in the period that Danya Beatrice lived, by Italian Capuchins. And we'll come back to the role of those Italian priests in a little bit. It had a capital city called Sao Salvador, which was a highly symbolic and even sacred space for the Congolese people. It was also one of the ways that Congolese kings drew their political legitimacy by ruling in Sao Salvador, because it had been the seat of the kingdom for centuries. And so being situated, having your court at Sao Salvador was a way of really claiming ownership of the kingdom. This is a print from 1676 by Ogilvy and Dappers, who were a Dutch printmaking company, which indicates not just the importance of Sao Salvador for the Congolese themselves, but the fact that this was a city and a society that was positioned within a broader interconnected world. European explorers and traders knew Sao Salvador, had traveled to Sao Salvador. Which brings me to the slave trade. Now, in the 17th and 18th centuries, Congo was absolutely at the heart of the Atlantic slave trade. This map tracks that trade up until 1900, so it's a sort of larger body of data than what I'm speaking about specifically today. But you can see here where this thick green bar is emanating from West Central Africa. That is exactly where the Kingdom of the Congo was situated, kind of right here on the bottom bit of the bar. And I don't know if you can see, but this indicates that more than 5 million people were transported from or through this area of the world and sold into slavery, predominantly in Brazil and the West Indies. Now, because of the complete economic dominance of the slave trade at the time, slavery was absolutely integral to Congo's foreign trade and its economy. But being a subject of the kingdom of the King of Congo did bring with it certain rights of citizenship. Even though the kingdom was involved in the slave trade, it was actually illegal to enslave any free Congolese citizen. And we know that this protection was taken seriously because when the kingdom was strong, its borders were actively defended, and there were basically no slaving raids across the kingdom's borders. But when it was politically weak and unstable, we have many instances of free Congolese being captured and sold. But the remarkable thing is that after political stability was restored in these situations, when things had broken down, when people were captured, we have historical records of various Congolese kings paying ransoms in order to get their citizens back, sometimes from as far away as Brazil. Now, this was not sort of a blanket practice. It was more often employed when elites had been captured and enslaved, but we do have situations of envoys being sent into the Americas trying to reclaim Congolese citizens. So there were really particular protections that came along with being a subject of the Kingdom of the Congo. Now, our story of Doña Beatriz and the civil war that she and her followers tried to end really begins in the 1600s. And for the first half of that century, the Kingdom of Congo fought frequently with the Portuguese colony that was immediately to its south. And that was based around the port city of Luanda. So these borders were at times sort of porous and fungible and moving. Now, during the first half of the 17th century, the Kingdom of Congo is doing pretty well. It's economically strong, it's politically stable, and it wins most of the skirmishes and the battles that it conducts with the Portuguese. So it's able to maintain its borders and sometimes even to expand them. But in 1665, the luck of the Congolese turns, and the Portuguese win a major battle at a border town of Mbwila. Now, the important thing to know about the Battle of Mbwila is that the Congolese king who led them into the battle, King Antonio I, was killed. He was beheaded. So that was very bad for Antonio, of course. But what was even worse for his subjects and his kingdom was that in addition to him being killed, his heir, his son, was captured and kidnapped in the battle. And he was a child, and he was taken back to Luanda. So the Kingdom of the Congo came out of the Battle of Mbwila without their monarch and without his heir. And this basically left a power vacuum in the kingdom, which allows a contest for the throne to begin. And three competing families assert claims to legitimacy to rise to the Congolese throne. These were the Kimpanzus, the Kinlazas, and the Agua de Rosadas. Now, don't worry, you don't need to remember any of these names. There won't be a quiz. But you may want to keep Pedro IV of the Agua de Rosadas, he's there in green, in mind, because I will come back to him a little bit later. But really, the key thing to take away from this is that for more than 40 years, from 1665 after the Battle of Mbwila until 1709, when the kingdom is finally reunified, these three factions fight it out to control the Congolese throne. Sometimes two are in alliance with one another, sometimes all three of them are at war. And in the process of all of this fighting, the capital city, that sacred sort of symbolic space in South Salvador, is sacked and destroyed. So the city's basically dismantled, many of the buildings are destroyed, and all of its population winds up fleeing into the countryside to escape the fighting. And as a result, each of these factions, each of these three sort of dynastic families that are competing to rule, move to their own regional bases, and they set up competing centers of power. And you can see on the map, I've tried to indicate those with the different colored stars. You have the Kinlazas up here where the red star is, the Agua de Rosadas led by Pedro IV here where the green star is, and the Kimpanzus down here in the south where the blue star is. And here in the center, this sort of exploding looking emoji is where Sao Salvador, that original capital city, is. So these bases of power are sort of relatively equidistant around that former capital city. So after the sack of Sao Salvador, each of these families has its own capital, its own regional stronghold, and its own army, which is mostly drummed up through conscription of ordinary peasants in the area. And they regularly clash over who has the most legitimate claim to rule. Between 1665 and 1709, when the kingdom is finally reunified, there are 16 different kings, each of them having different claims to legitimacy and to lineage. I'm not going to go into the deeply kind of confusing family lines that get asserted. But you have 16 kings over this period. Of them, 8 of them are killed while they are ruling, and some of them only last in the position for a couple of months at most. So life expectancy for being a king of the Congo in this period is not good at all. And as you might imagine, this also makes being a villager or an ordinary person in the kingdom also a very precarious position to be in. If you were a man, at any moment, the local army might march through and would conscript you to fight with them. If you were a woman, you were in charge of the cultivation of crops and raising food, but the frequent conflict and mobilization of armies throughout the area meant that you might have to pick up and leave your home, leave your village, leave your crops at a moment's notice. So even if you were lucky enough to avoid the fighting, to avoid the violence, it was likely to leave you homeless and hungry. Now, on top of all of that, political instability weakened the kingdom, and slave raiding and capture increased significantly as that political strength dissipated. So I mentioned that when things were stable and the borders were defended, there were no slave raids, and when they were not stable, slave raids tick up. So in this period, things are very unstable, and you have a lot of cross-border raiding. And the Congolese people couldn't rely on a strong king to protect them from enslavement anymore, because the institution of the monarchy had been so deteriorated by all of this fighting. Now, this is the world that Doña Beatriz Quimpa-Vida is born into in 1684. And her whole life as a young woman was shaped around the insecurity of living in a war zone, effectively. But it was also shaped by the stories that she had heard from elders about the time before the fighting, because that was within older people's living memory. About when the king was very strong and was holding his court in Sao Salvador, when he defended his people. It had also been shaped, her upbringing had also been shaped by the institution of the Catholic Church as it was manifested in the Congo. And as I mentioned in Doña Beatriz's life, this was brought predominantly through Italian Capuchin priests. Now, when Doña Beatriz was 20 in 1704, she got very, very ill. She had a terrible fever, and she was so sick that her family worried that she might die. And that wouldn't have been an uncommon result of a severe fever at the time. While she had this fever, she had a vision of St. Anthony of Padua, who she had heard about from those Italian missionaries. And in her vision, St. Anthony came to Doña Beatriz, and he told her that she was destined to lead the Congo to peace out of all of this fighting. And that the way to do that was to restore the king to his throne in Sao Salvador and to rebuild that city. At this point, Sao Salvador had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. So after the destruction of the sack of the city and all of the fighting, it had just been completely worn down and deteriorated. So rebuilding was a big prospect. Now, Doña Beatriz had this vision in this sort of fevered state. And almost miraculously, she didn't die. She recovered from the fever. And when she woke up, she told her family and her friends that she had now been reincarnated by God as St. Anthony. So not just that he had come to visit her in this vision, but that she had become him effectively. And she said that she, who was now he, St. Anthony, was going to lead the Congolese people back to Sao Salvador and to restore peace in the kingdom. Now, because she had been so close to death, Doña Beatriz's family and her friends and her village all believed that this was miraculous. They had expected her to die. It was a miracle that she had been cured. And they believed that the miracle had been facilitated by St. Anthony. There was a tradition of spirit possession in Congo that predated Catholicism. So the idea of being possessed by a dead male saint, if you were a young woman, was less weird for them than it might seem to us. And for the next year, Doña Beatriz, as St. Anthony, went around the countryside preaching her message of peace and reunification in villages in the countryside. And at first, she began to gather followers, first hundreds of them, who called themselves Little Anthonys, and they became her emissaries. And they went out into further villages to continue to preach her message until it was spread all across the divided kingdom of Congo. So there were Little Anthonys operating in all of the 3 different divided regions within the kingdom. And finally, in 1705, at the age of 21, Doña Beatriz and thousands of her followers marched to the abandoned city of Sao Salvador, and they began to rebuild it and to settle there. And after months of being in the city, of actively rebuilding, of being settled, and avoiding any sort of further violence, Doña Beatriz was able to use the political capital she had gained through her movement and by occupying the city to persuade Pedro IV, the head of the Agua de Rosada families, to come and to set up court there. She had, after a great deal of deliberation, decided that his was the most legitimate claim to the throne. So in 1705, Doña Beatriz actually finally achieves the restoration of the Congolese monarchy, 40 years after the Battle of Umbuila began the Civil War. Now, if I end the story there, it's a pretty happy ending. But unfortunately for Doña Beatriz, the story didn't end there, and things didn't end so well for her. She wound up falling foul of the same Italian missionaries who had taught her about St. Anthony to begin with. Now, Doña Beatriz and her followers professed to be, and certainly considered themselves, Catholics, good Catholics. But the Italian missionaries in the area did not agree. Because the Antonians rewrote and adapted prayers and symbols of Catholicism for their new Antonian movement, the Italian missionaries perceived them as subverting the true Catholicism. So here we have 2 examples of some of the artifacts that the Antonian movement produced. We have an Antonian cross, where you can see the figure of St. Anthony is on the cross, sort of transposing the position of Christ, and then another small little statue of St. Anthony. And these were very common religious artifacts that became extremely popular in Congo through the Antonian movement and indeed after it. They also rewrote and adapted prayers for their Antonian movement. So instead of the Salve Regina, they had the Salve Antoniana. So they're very much working within Catholic tropes, but also transposing them, rewriting them for their own methods. And they did so in ways that the formal representatives of the Catholic Church in the country were not happy with. These were the Capuchin priests, and they were very suspicious of Doña Beatriz and her movement. They were willing to believe that she was possessed, as she had said, but they didn't think that she was possessed by the spirit of St. Anthony. They were pretty convinced that she was possessed by the devil. And this was a problem for Doña Beatriz because the priests themselves were also in a strong political position. Throughout the course of the Civil War, they had been acting as arbiters between the Vatican and all three of the different competing royal houses in Congo. So the priests were basically kind of neutral parties who moved between the competing factions and also mediated with Rome, because all three of the different factions were actively Catholic. And the priests had a stroke of luck in the spring of 1706, after Doña Beatriz had restored Sao Salvador, when it was discovered, actually sort of by accident, that Doña Beatriz had recently given birth to a baby in secret. And this was problematic because, apart from violating church laws about chastity, which Doña Beatriz adhered to and preached in her movement, it was a very hard thing to explain because, of course, Doña Beatriz was supposed to be St. Anthony, the male St. Anthony. So explaining how she had produced a child was challenging. And the priests saw this as an opportunity to arrest her and to bring her to Pedro. And they make a strong case to him that her positioning herself as the reincarnated St. Anthony is in fact actually heresy. And they wanted to stop the spread of her movement because they saw her as spreading this heresy throughout the countryside and subverting what they perceived as true Catholicism. They finally were able to prevail on Pedro IV that Doña Beatriz was in fact possessed not by St. Anthony, but by the devil. And so they convinced him to burn her at the stake. And he does that in 1706. In July of 1706, Doña Beatriz is executed. And this is the end of the story for Doña Beatriz, but it isn't for her movement. Despite her own death, the Antonian movement and the push for peace that she had started continued. And actually, given that the origins of her movement were based in a theology of reincarnation, that somebody could re-inhabit a body and be brought back from death, Doña Beatriz's actual death didn't dampen her movement at all. It continued to push for peace until the kingdom was finally reunified in 1709. And so here maybe is the happy ending. Most historians agree that Doña Beatriz and her followers played a crucial role in bringing peace to the Congo after decades of civil war.